The world had changed overnight. The virus spread faster than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just any infection, it was a plague. People dropped like flies, turning into the mindless, relentless undead. The plague spread so quickly that governments failed to react in time, leaving cities in chaos, and humanity on the brink of extinction. Among the scattered remains of civilization, only a small group of survivors clung to hope, despite the horrors they faced each day. In a crumbling, abandoned town in what used to be the heart of America, a group of 5 survivors found shelter in the ruins of an old, dilapidated supermarket. The flickering lights from a generator cast eerie shadows on the walls as they huddled together in the darkness, each one exhausted, their faces grim with the weight of the world around them. The air inside smelled of mildew and decay, but it was safe, at least for now. They'd been here for days, running low on supplies, but it was a temporary reprieve from the nightmare that awaited them outside. There was Grace, a former nurse who had quickly become the group's de facto leader. Her calm demeanor and sharp instincts had kept them alive through countless close calls. Grace knew what it took to survive, and she wasn't about to let her group slip into despair. Then there was Marcus, the ex-soldier. He had fought in foreign wars, but nothing had prepared him for the horrors of the plague. His military training made him invaluable, but it also weighed on him. Every life lost, every person turned into a zombie, felt like a failure he couldn't shake off. His guilt was something he buried deep inside, though, never showing it in front of the others. Sarah, a high school teacher, had been one of the first to join the group. She wasn't trained for this, but she was resourceful and always had a way of keeping the others' spirits up with her optimism, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. Her ability to read people and stay positive was a rare gift in these dark times. The youngest member of the group was Jake, just 16 years old. He had been living with his single mother when the plague struck. She was one of the first to be infected. Despite his grief, Jake was a quick learner, adapting to the harsh new world around him. He spent most of his time tinkering with whatever he could find, guns, radios, makeshift traps, but the horrors of the plague had taken a toll on his innocence, turning him into someone much older than his years. Lastly, there was Elena, a quiet and mysterious woman who joined the group under strange circumstances. She was a survivalist by nature, always prepared and always ready for the worst. Her past was a mystery to the others, but they didn't question her. They trusted her skills, even though there was something about her that seemed off. Maybe it was the way she never spoke about her past or how she always volunteered to scout the dangerous areas. Whatever it was, Elena was a valuable asset, and they needed her more than they cared to admit. The survivors had been through hell and back, and each of them knew that the world they once knew was gone. But there was something driving them forward, a glimmer of hope that they could survive, even in the face of unimaginable odds. As they sat around a small fire, huddled close for warmth, the crackling of the flames was the only sound that filled the silence. They spoke in hushed tones, knowing that the slightest noise could attract the zombies lurking just outside. They'd learned that lesson the hard way. The undead had an uncanny ability to sense movement, sound, or even the slightest tremor in the air. "I've been thinking," Grace began, her voice low, her eyes scanning the map they had spread out on the cracked concrete floor. "We need to get to the old military base to the north. It's our best shot at finding weapons, more supplies, and maybe even more survivors." Marcus didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as he considered the plan. "It's a risk," he finally muttered, running a hand over his face. "We don't know what we'll find there. It could be crawling with infected, or worse." "But we can't stay here forever," Sarah interjected, her voice a little more forceful than usual. "We're running out of food. And what happens when the zombies find us here?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't want to die here," he whispered. "I don't want to die anywhere." Elena, sitting at the edge of the group, was the last to speak. Her eyes, distant and calculating, seemed to pierce through the others. "We go north," she said simply, her voice cold. "But we do it on our terms." There was no more argument. The decision was made. As night fell, the group made their preparations. They gathered what little they had left, ammo, food, and medical supplies, each item carefully checked and double-checked. They knew they would have to move quietly, quickly, and without hesitation. Their journey would be long, and the dangers ahead were unimaginable, but there was no other choice. With a final glance at the map, Grace gave the signal, and the group moved out, slipping into the shadows of the night, their hearts heavy with the weight of the unknown. Outside, the world was silent. But somewhere, in the distance, the unmistakable groan of the undead echoed through the empty streets. The hunt was on. The wind howled through the broken windows of the supermarket as the small group of survivors moved silently into the night. The pale moonlight cast long shadows over the streets, and the familiar sounds of the world before the plague now felt like distant memories, replaced by the groans of the undead that echoed through the desolate town. Grace led the way, her every step measured and cautious. She had spent hours studying the map, committing every detail to memory, but even with the plan in mind, the uncertainty gnawed at her. Every turn, every alley, could be a trap. The world had become a giant maze of death, with no clear way out. Behind her, Marcus walked with a tense alertness, his hand always near the weapon strapped to his waist. His eyes scanned the darkness, every corner, every shadow. The smell of death lingered in the air, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were already being watched. The night was alive with the soft scrape of zombie feet on pavement, the distant moans from a few undead who had wandered too far from their pack. Sarah followed closely, her hand tightly gripping the crowbar she had scavenged from the supermarket earlier. She wasn't as used to the violence of the world now, but she had quickly learned that to survive, you had to be willing to fight. She thought of her students, wondered if any of them had made it out. The question haunted her. Was anyone else still out there, or had they all been consumed by the plague? Jake trailed behind Sarah, his gaze darting nervously to every sound, every movement in the corner of his eye. The weight of his grief was heavy on his shoulders, but he carried it silently, never voicing his pain. He missed his mom more than anything, but she was gone. And now, his focus had shifted to survival, though he couldn't shake the guilt that he wasn't doing enough to protect the others. Elena brought up the rear, always the quiet observer. She had a strange sense of calm about her that was unsettling to the others. The silence around her seemed to magnify her presence, and they couldn't help but wonder if she was hiding something, or if she was simply too cold to let the horrors of the world affect her. But there was no time to question her now. They needed her skills, her preparedness, and her resourcefulness. The town they were moving through had once been bustling with life, but now it was nothing more than a graveyard. Abandoned cars lined the streets, some overturned, others abandoned in hasty escape attempts. Broken windows stared out like empty eyes. There was no sign of humanity, except for the occasional distant groan of the infected, whose numbers seemed to grow by the day. Grace's voice broke the silence. "We'll need to take the back roads to avoid the main streets," she whispered. "The military base is only a few miles north, but we need to be careful. There's no telling what's out there." They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, staying out of sight. The group's every step was calculated, and there was little room for error. Every rustle in the trees, every faint noise from the darkness, made their hearts race. There was no trust in the world anymore, only fear. After an hour of walking, they reached the edge of town. The streets here were even more desolate. They had to cross a small bridge to reach the wooded area that would lead them to the military base, and Grace knew that would be their greatest challenge yet. The bridge was too exposed, too wide open, and they would have no cover once they reached the other side. "Stay low," Marcus instructed, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "We can't risk being seen." As they crept across the bridge, the quiet groans of zombies grew louder. Grace held up a hand, signaling them to stop. There, in the distance, a small group of the undead was shuffling aimlessly, their heads swiveling, sniffing the air. "How many?" Elena whispered. 5 or 6, Grace answered, her voice steady. "But we can't risk getting too close." Jake shuddered, his face pale. "What if they see us?" "They won't," Marcus said, his voice low. "Just stay still and wait." The seconds felt like hours as they crouched in the shadows, the wind rustling through the leaves, masking their presence. The undead weren't the sharpest creatures, at least, not when it came to things like reason or tactics, but they could sense movement. Grace's grip tightened on the rifle slung over her shoulder, her fingers itching to act, but she knew patience was their best weapon. Finally, the zombies passed, their stumbling forms moving toward the town center. Grace signaled for the group to move. "Now," she whispered. They sprinted across the bridge, their footsteps muffled by the wind and the sound of their pounding hearts. When they reached the trees, they slowed to a careful pace again, the danger not quite behind them but at least a little further away. "That was too close," Sarah muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. "We can't afford to get complacent," Grace replied, her eyes scanning the tree line. "Keep moving. We're not safe yet." But even as they ventured deeper into the woods, the feeling of being hunted never left them. The world had become a predator's jungle. No matter how far they went, the undead were never far behind. The group could feel the weight of the hunt on their shoulders. And the closer they got to the military base, the more they realized it might not be the salvation they were hoping for. The journey through the woods felt like an eternity. Each step was calculated, each rustle in the underbrush sent them into a brief moment of panic, and every breath was held in anticipation of what lurked just beyond the trees. The air was thick with the smell of decay, both from the infected and the once living remnants of the world that had come before. Grace led the group, her eyes scanning the horizon. They had been moving for hours, and the distant lights of the military base should have been in view by now. But instead of seeing the welcoming sight of barricades and soldiers, all they saw was the eerie silence of the forest stretching out before them. There were no signs of life, no reassuring sounds of gunfire or patrols. "It's too quiet," Marcus muttered, his hand gripping his weapon tighter. "I don't like this." "Stay focused," Grace replied, though her own unease was growing. "We'll make it. It's just over the next ridge." Jake, who had been walking silently, looked around nervously. What if they're all gone? What if the base was overrun? "It wouldn't have been abandoned so easily," Elena said, her voice low and unsettlingly calm. "Military bases are designed to hold up. They'd have fought to the last man." "But what if it didn't matter?" Sarah said, a tremor of fear in her voice. "What if it was a massacre? What if they lost and the infected?" She stopped herself, not wanting to voice the horror they all feared. Grace held up a hand. "We're not there yet. We'll know soon enough." They continued through the dense underbrush, their pace slowing as they approached a hill that would give them a view of the base. As they neared the top, the first signs of the military installation appeared in the distance, the large, gray walls of the compound, crumbling and overgrown with vines. But something was wrong. The perimeter, once fortified, now seemed disheveled, the gates broken and wide open. "There should be soldiers guarding the entrance," Marcus whispered, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Maybe they're waiting for us," Jake said, but there was no conviction in his words. Grace motioned for everyone to stay low as they crept toward the edge of the ridge. They all stopped and took a careful look at what lay before them. The base was eerily silent. There were no signs of movement, no patrols, no vehicles. It was as if the entire compound had been abandoned, yet the gates were wide open. "The walls should be patrolled," Elena muttered, her eyes scanning the base. "This doesn't feel right." Grace nodded in agreement. "We need to get closer. We'll stick to the trees. If the base has fallen, we need to know what's inside." They made their way down the ridge, carefully navigating the overgrown terrain. As they approached the outer perimeter, they could see the remnants of old military vehicles, some abandoned, others half hidden by fallen trees and rubble. The whole place had a ghostly quality to it. The military base, once a symbol of strength and order, was now a graveyard. When they reached the main gate, Grace stopped them. She squatted beside the gate's rusted metal frame, checking for any signs of recent activity. There were no fresh tire tracks, no footprints. Everything was still, but it felt wrong. Something was missing. "Something doesn't add up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get inside and figure out what happened." They pushed through the gate, careful not to make a sound. Inside, the base was even more unsettling. The buildings, once meticulously organized, were now in disarray. Doors hung off their hinges, windows were shattered, and papers were scattered across the ground as though someone, or something, had been searching for something. But there was no sign of life. Grace stepped forward, motioning for the others to follow her. "Let's check the command center. That's where we'll find the answers." They entered one of the larger buildings, which looked like it had once been a command post. The interior was dark, save for the weak moonlight filtering through the broken windows. As they moved deeper into the building, they found signs of a struggle, bloodstains on the walls, overturned desks, and a trail of broken glass. Suddenly, Jake froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. The group stilled, listening intently. There it was again, a low, guttural growl coming from deeper inside the building. "Stay quiet," Marcus hissed, his body tense as he pressed his back against the wall. Elena was the first to move. With a swift motion, she reached into her pack and pulled out a flashlight. She clicked it on, casting a thin beam of light down the hall. The light flickered briefly, and for a moment, everything seemed still. Then, the shadows moved. A figure appeared at the far end of the hall, slumped over, dragging its feet, a low moan escaping its throat. Another zombie. And then another. And another. The group tensed. There were at least 5 of them. "Get ready," Grace whispered, her hand gripping her rifle. "We'll have to take them out quietly." But as the group prepared to engage the zombies, they heard something else, something far worse. A door behind them creaked open, and a new sound echoed in the hallway. The sound of more footsteps. But these were different. They weren't dragging. They were fast, deliberate. And they were getting closer. "We're not alone," Sarah murmured, her breath catching in her throat. Suddenly, the hallway lit up with bright lights, blinding them momentarily. A voice echoed through the darkness, cold and authoritative. "Who goes there?" The group spun around to find a figure standing in the doorway, a man, dressed in military fatigues, his face hidden behind a gas mask. But there was something off about him. His eyes were wide and frantic, his movements jerky. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his voice trembling. "I need help. Please. You have to get out of here. They're coming." Before they could react, the sound of rapid, pounding footsteps echoed through the halls, and the floor began to shake. The ground beneath them rumbled with a horrible intensity. They weren't alone. And the worst was yet to come. The soldier's words were a chilling warning, but before anyone could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled again, harder this time. The walls creaked ominously, and the distant sound of shuffling feet echoed through the building. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she instinctively gripped her rifle tighter. "We need to move. Now!" Marcus shouted. The group didn't need any further prompting. In one fluid motion, they dashed toward the nearest doorway, their footsteps echoing through the dark corridors of the military base. The soldier, still trembling, backed away from them, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't you understand?" the man gasped, his voice frantic. "You'll never make it out. They've turned. The soldiers, the scientists, all of them. They've all been turned." His words cut through the air like a knife, and for a moment, the group stopped. Their eyes met, a shared understanding of the horror he was describing. They had known, in the back of their minds, that the base might have fallen, but to hear it confirmed was something else entirely. The military, the last bastion of civilization, had succumbed to the plague. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "If what he's saying is true, there's no safe place left." Elena, always the pragmatist, was already looking for another exit. "The back door." "Follow me." The soldier, still shaking, took a few cautious steps forward, his gaze darting between the group and the hallway behind him. "You don't understand. It's worse than you think." They've been experimenting. They... Before he could finish, the sound of something heavy crashing to the ground echoed through the hallway. A grotesque groan followed, sharp and guttural. The soldier's face went pale. No, 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 it's them. Without another word, he bolted toward the back of the building, the door leading into what appeared to be a storage area. The survivors hesitated for a brief moment, then followed. The sound of rapid, slapping footsteps grew louder, a terrifying sign that the infected were closing in on them. As they sprinted through the hallways, Grace's mind raced. What kind of experiments had been conducted here? What had the military done that could have caused this level of chaos? But there was no time to dwell on those questions. They had to survive. They had to find a way out. They burst into the storage room, a narrow space filled with crates and metal shelves. There were only two exits, the back door, which the soldier had headed for, and a small window at the far end. Elena scanned the room quickly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. We'll go through the window, she decided. It's our only chance. The others nodded in agreement. As they made their way toward the window, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of scraping feet. The infected were already inside the base, and they were getting closer. Grace turned to the soldier, who was still shaking in the corner, clutching a gun that he didn't seem to know how to use. Come on, she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. You need to move. The man nodded, wide-eyed, and scrambled toward the window. But just as he reached it, another crash echoed from the hallway, followed by a chorus of guttural growls. The infected had arrived. We're not gonna make it, the soldier muttered, his voice breaking. Grace ignored him. She grabbed a nearby crate and shoved it against the window, prying it open with a force she didn't know she had left. Everyone, out. Now. Marcus was the first to scramble through, followed by Sarah. Elena was already at the window, her body lithe and fast, slipping through the opening with ease. Jake hesitated, his face filled with fear. He didn't want to leave, but Grace was already pushing him through. Go, she urged, looking back only once to see the soldier still frozen in fear. She shoved him toward the window, but he didn't budge. Help me, he cried, his voice frantic. Grace hesitated for a split second, torn between saving him or getting out. But the low growl of the infected grew louder, closer. There was no time. She grabbed the soldier's wrist and pulled him with her, forcing him through the window just as the first of the infected shambled into the room. As the last of the group made it through, the window slammed shut behind them, leaving the military base behind. They found themselves in a small courtyard, the dark sky overhead offering no comfort. The sound of the infected was unmistakable now, an all-consuming, hollow noise that filled the air with dread. Where now? Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. He was out of breath, his body aching from the constant running. We head east, Grace said, already setting a direction. We find shelter. We regroup and figure out what's going on. But the soldier was still shaking, his eyes wide and unblinking. You don't understand, he stammered again. There's no shelter. Not anymore. The plague, what they did here, it spread. It spread to every corner of the base. And now it's out of control. You can't outrun it. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had known the world was falling apart, but to hear it confirmed in such a terrifying way was something else entirely. They weren't just running from the infected now, they were running from the unknown. Grace placed a hand on the soldier's trembling shoulder, trying to steady him. Tell us what you know. What did they do here? The soldier's face twisted in fear. It was the serum, they were trying to create a cure, a vaccine. But it mutated. The infected became faster, smarter. They could communicate, organize. They were breeding them for an army. And now they're everywhere. The words hit like a slap to the face. An army of infected. The horror of what had been unleashed here was only beginning to sink in. We need to get moving, Elena said, her voice sharp and practical. We don't have time to waste. They began to move, but the shadow of what lay ahead hung over them like a storm cloud. As they pushed through the courtyard and into the dense woods beyond, the sound of shuffling feet and low growls followed them. The infected were relentless. The world was no longer just a place of death, it had become a battleground. And now, they were part of a fight they didn't fully understand, with enemies they couldn't even begin to imagine. The only certainty they had was that their survival depended on getting far, far away from the base. But no matter how far they ran, the infected were never far behind. The thick woods offered little comfort as the group moved further away from the military base. The trees were dense, their shadows long and heavy under the moonlight. Grace kept her pace steady, leading the group as they trudged through the underbrush, the air cool and damp with the scent of earth and decay. They could still hear the distant growls of the infected, carried by the wind, reminding them that they were not safe, not yet. The soldier, whose name, it turned out, was Sergeant Matthews, had not spoken since they'd escaped the base. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, his gait uneven, as if the very act of moving was a struggle for him. The others, while grateful for his knowledge of the base's layout, were growing increasingly wary of him. His story was full of holes, and his constant shaking didn't inspire confidence. Grace had no time to dwell on it. Their focus had to be survival, not questioning every person they met. They had bigger problems now, namely, the army of infected that Matthews had warned them about. "We can't keep running," Sarah muttered under her breath, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting a horde of zombies to burst through the trees at any moment. "We'll never outrun them." "We don't have much of a choice," Marcus replied. His face was set, his jaw tight. He had been in this situation before, never without the constant pressure of fear, but always with the knowledge that they had to keep moving or die. "We need to find shelter," Elena said sharply. "There has to be a cabin, a house, something nearby. If we don't find shelter by sunrise, we're as good as dead." "Yeah, that's the plan," Grace agreed, eyes scanning the horizon. "We find shelter, and we figure out our next move. We're not sticking around here long enough for those things to catch up." But as the minutes dragged on and the silence stretched between them, there was no sign of shelter, only trees and more trees. The wilderness around them had become an endless maze, its beauty twisted by the looming threat of death. The sounds of the forest were eerily calm, except for the occasional crack of a twig underfoot, the distant call of an owl, or the soft rustling of leaves. Then, out of nowhere, Matthews stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with panic. He had heard something they couldn't yet see. "What is it?" Grace asked, her voice tense. Matthews slowly raised his hand, signaling for silence. Everyone froze, straining to hear what had caught his attention. The forest was quiet for a moment, but then they heard it, slow, shuffling footsteps, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The infected were coming. "Move!" Grace barked. "Head for the ridge. Now!" The group scrambled into action, running with all their strength, pushing through the trees, each footfall echoing in the tense silence. The growls grew louder, closer. They were closing in, and they could feel the ground tremble beneath them. The infected were fast, faster than they'd anticipated. Whatever had happened at the base, Matthew's warning about the mutations seemed all too real. Grace's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder. She could just make out the pale, hunched figures moving through the trees, at least 5, maybe more. Their eyes glinted in the dark, tracking their every movement with unnatural precision. "They're following us." Jake's voice cracked, panic rising in his chest. "I know," Marcus shouted back, but there was no time to explain. He turned sharply and grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him along as they sped up. "Keep going," Grace urged, her voice strained. "We need to get to higher ground." They reached the ridge moments later, the incline steep and difficult to navigate. Their breath came in sharp gasps as they scrambled to the top, the infected still relentlessly pursuing them. As they reached the crest, they paused, looking down at the valley below. There, in the distance, they saw the faint outline of a building, isolated, hidden amongst the trees. "That's our chance," Elena said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We head for that building." They didn't hesitate. The group turned and made a mad dash toward the structure, their feet barely touching the ground as they pushed themselves harder. The infected were close now, too close for comfort, their guttural growls growing louder with each passing second. They reached the building, a small, dilapidated cabin, in less than 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Grace kicked open the door, and they all rushed inside, slamming it shut behind them. The room was musty, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Old furniture, broken and overturned, littered the floor, but it would have to do. There was no time to be picky. They quickly barricaded the door with whatever they could find, chairs, tables, anything that would buy them time. Once inside, they collapsed against the walls, panting heavily. The cabin was a temporary refuge, but it was the best they could do. For a few moments, there was only silence, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. But then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of scratching at the door, followed by the low growl of the infected. They were close, and the cabin wouldn't hold them off forever. "We need to figure out what to do next," Grace said, her voice a little shakier than she would have liked. "The door won't last long." Matthews, still trembling in the corner, finally spoke. "We can't stay here. The infected, they'll find us. They're getting smarter. They're not like before, they can smell us from miles away, and they'll stop at nothing to get in." His words hung in the air, chilling them to the bone. "What do you mean?" "Smell us?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Matthews nodded. The experiments at the base, they weren't just about creating super soldiers. They were trying to enhance the infected, to make them more adaptive, more intelligent. The mutation made them stronger, but it also gave them senses they didn't have before, heightened smell, hearing, tracking abilities. They can pick up our scent from miles away. We won't be able to outrun them for long. The room fell silent as his words sunk in. The truth was even worse than they'd feared, they weren't just up against the mindless hordes anymore. They were dealing with creatures that could think, that could track, that could hunt. "We don't have much time," Grace said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming weight of the situation. "We need a plan." But the clock was ticking, and the sounds outside grew louder. The infected were relentless. And now, the group wasn't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their lives, trapped in a cabin with no way out. The cabin groaned under the pressure of the infected outside. The door rattled violently as the creatures slammed against it, their growls muffled but unmistakable. Every noise outside seemed to grow louder, closer, more insistent, as if the infected could smell their fear, could sense their growing desperation. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She moved swiftly around the cabin, her hands shaking only slightly as she checked the windows and bolted them shut with whatever materials they could find. Elena was working on reinforcing the door, wedging the old furniture tighter against it. "We don't have long," Grace said, her voice calm, yet urgent. "They're going to break through. We need a way out." The group was tense, each person trapped in their own mind as they considered their options. Matthews, who had been silent for too long, finally broke his paralysis. His eyes, wide and filled with fear, were fixed on the door. "They're getting smarter," Matthews said, his voice a strained whisper. "I've seen it before. They're learning how to break through barriers, how to open doors. It's not just brute strength anymore." "Then we need to keep them out long enough to come up with something," Grace said firmly, pushing her doubts aside. "We can't stay here. We won't last." She glanced at the others, looking for any sign of hope, any suggestion. Elena stepped forward, her face set with determination. "We need to leave the cabin. If we stay here, we're dead," Elena said, her eyes sharp as she scanned the room. "There's a road about half a mile east from here. If we can get there, we might be able to find transportation. We could drive out." "Drive out?" Jake echoed, his voice incredulous. "There's no way they left vehicles intact. The whole area's a war zone." "It's our best chance," Elena replied. We can't just sit here and wait to be eaten. If there are vehicles, we take one. If there's nothing, we keep moving on foot. How do we get there? Sarah asked, her voice shaky but resolute. The infected will be on us the second we step outside. We move quickly and quietly, Grace said, her voice taking on the sharp edge of leadership. We'll leave through the back. Matthews, can you find a way to distract them? We need to buy ourselves time. Matthews nodded, though his face was pale with fear. He stepped away from the corner where he had been standing, and Grace noticed how his hands were trembling. He was trying to hide it, but it was clear to her now that his resolve was slipping. He wasn't the soldier he once was. He was just another broken person trying to survive. I'll try, Matthews said, his voice strained. But we won't have much time. If we don't move fast enough, they'll catch up. Understood, Grace said, taking charge. We'll move when you give us the signal. The group moved to the back of the cabin, carefully positioning themselves behind the thin walls that barely shielded them from the impending danger. Matthews approached the back door, his face drawn in concentration. He reached for a broken piece of wood on the floor, and with shaky hands, he began to work at the hinges. We'll need to be as quiet as possible, Elena whispered. The slightest noise will give us away. The minutes stretched like hours as Matthews worked, and just as Grace was beginning to wonder if they were making a mistake, the back door creaked open. Matthews held up his hand to signal them. Now, he whispered. With practiced precision, the group bolted out of the cabin, moving in a low crouch, sticking to the shadows. They could hear the infected outside, the gnashing of teeth and the scraping of claws against the wood as they clawed at the door. Every second felt like an eternity, but they pushed forward, silently making their way toward the trees. They moved fast, adrenaline coursing through their veins, their bodies pumping with the raw, primal energy needed to survive. Each footstep was calculated, each breath shallow as they moved deeper into the forest. The road Elena had spoken of was close, just a half-mile, maybe less. But as they moved, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, more frantic. The infected were closing in, driven by an insatiable hunger. Keep moving. Grace hissed, glancing over her shoulder. Don't stop until we're at the road. The forest felt endless, each tree a barrier that they had to navigate, each branch a potential trap. It was difficult to keep their bearings in the dark, but they couldn't afford to slow down. Behind them, the infected were coming closer, their guttural growls growing in intensity. The faintest rustle of leaves was enough to send Grace's heart racing as she strained to listen for any sign of movement behind her. They rounded a bend in the trees, and then, through the thick foliage, Grace saw it, an old, abandoned road, just as Elena had said. It was barely visible through the trees, but it was there. There! Elena shouted, pointing to the clearing ahead. We're almost there. But as they neared the road, the growls of the infected grew louder. They were closer now, so close they could almost feel the heat of their breath on their necks. Get to the road! Grace barked. Go! The group broke into a sprint, the full weight of their fear propelling them forward. They pushed past the last line of trees and burst onto the road, their eyes scanning frantically for any sign of vehicles, any chance of escape. And then, just as the infected burst from the woods behind them, they saw it. A military jeep, abandoned at the side of the road, its engine still warm. Over there! Marcus shouted. Without a second thought, they ran toward the jeep, Grace taking the lead. Matthews was the first to reach the vehicle, yanking open the door and sliding into the driver's seat. The others piled in quickly, Elena in the front passenger seat, while Sarah and Jake jumped into the back. Start it up! Grace urged, her heart racing. Matthews fumbled with the ignition, his hands still shaking with fear. For a heart-stopping moment, the engine sputtered and died, and the growls of the infected echoed around them, growing louder with every passing second. Come on! Grace shouted, panic rising in her throat. Finally, the engine roared to life. Matthews slammed his foot on the gas, and the jeep lurched forward, kicking up dirt as they sped away from the clearing. Behind them, the infected chased them, but the Jeep was faster, roaring down the road at breakneck speed. The group looked back, their hearts still pounding, but the infected were already falling behind. For now, they were safe. For now, they had escaped the horror. But Grace knew it wouldn't be the last time they would be hunted. The infected were evolving, and the world they knew was slipping further into chaos. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the only road they had left. They didn't stop. Not yet. They couldn't. Not until they were sure they had outrun the nightmare that pursued them. For now, they were alive. The Jeep roared down the empty road, the engine humming as it tore through the night. The wheels kicked up dirt and debris, the sound of it filling the silence that had fallen over the group. Grace sat in the front seat, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The infected were nowhere in sight, but she knew better than to think they were safe for long. Matthews was still shaking, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, but he kept driving, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Elena sat next to him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She didn't speak, none of them did. The air inside the Jeep was thick with tension, the kind that came from surviving a close call and knowing that they weren't out of danger yet. "How far are we going?" Sarah's voice broke the silence from the back seat. Her eyes were wide with fear, her hands clutching her backpack as though it were a lifeline. "We keep going until we hit a safe zone," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the unease creeping in. "There has to be something out there. A military outpost, a shelter, anything." Matthews didn't respond, his lips pressed into a tight line as he navigated the winding road. The forest surrounding them seemed endless, the trees thick and imposing, their shadows stretching like fingers in the moonlight. There was nothing but darkness ahead, no sign of civilization. "Are we sure there's a safe zone?" Marcus spoke up from the back. He was sitting beside Jake, both of them staring out the windows, their eyes wide and alert. "What if the whole world's gone to hell? What if no one's left?" Grace turned to him, her gaze sharp. "There are survivors. There has to be. People don't just disappear." "But we haven't seen anyone else," Marcus shot back. "Not a single person. Just the infected. The whole thing feels like we're the last ones alive." The weight of his words hung in the air. It was a thought that had crossed Grace's mind as well, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to let doubt creep in now. They couldn't afford to believe they were the only ones left. Hope was all they had. Elena broke the tension, her voice quiet but determined. "We keep moving forward. That's all we can do." For a few moments, the only sound was the hum of the engine and the tires crunching over gravel. The Jeep sped through the wilderness, its headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. Grace's thoughts drifted to their past, the world they had known, the lives they had lived before the plague had shattered everything. She remembered the small joys, the laughter, the peace that once felt so ordinary. Now, all of it seemed like a distant dream. She shook her head, trying to push away the sadness that threatened to overwhelm her. There was no time for nostalgia. They needed to stay focused. "How much fuel do we have left?" Elena asked, her voice quiet but sharp with concern. Matthews glanced at the fuel gauge. It was nearly empty. "We've got maybe another hour, tops," he said, his voice tight. "Then we need to find somewhere to stop," Grace said. "Somewhere safe. A place to regroup." They continued on in silence, the landscape changing as they drove. The trees became less dense, and soon, the road opened up into a clearing. In the distance, they saw the faint outline of a building, small, but it looked intact. A glimmer of hope sparked in Grace's chest. "Over there," she said, pointing. "That looks like a place we can stop." Matthews turned the wheel, guiding the Jeep toward the building. As they drew closer, Grace saw that it was a small farmhouse, the kind that looked abandoned but still had the appearance of being lived in. It was surrounded by a broken-down fence, and the windows were dark. No signs of life. "Looks like no one's home," Elena said as they slowed to a stop. "Should we check it out?" "Yeah," Grace said, already unbuckling her seatbelt. We don't have much of a choice. We need to conserve fuel, and if there's supplies, we can restock. The group piled out of the jeep, weapons in hand, their senses on high alert. Matthews, still shaky but determined, led the way as they approached the front door of the farmhouse. Grace moved cautiously behind him, every step calculated. The silence around them was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of decay. "Stay close," Grace whispered to the others. "No matter what happens, don't split up." They reached the door, and Matthews gave it a tentative push. It creaked open, revealing a dark hallway inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was a faint smell of mildew in the air, but otherwise, it seemed undisturbed. "Hello?" Matthews called, his voice low, testing the emptiness. There was no answer. They stepped inside, the creaking of the floorboards echoing in the stillness. The house was small, its rooms sparsely furnished. Grace moved into the living room, scanning the space. A couple of chairs, an overturned table, and a dusty old TV were the only signs that anyone had ever lived here. No signs of life, no signs of infection. Just an eerie, unsettling quiet. "Clear," Matthews said after a quick sweep of the house. "There's no one here." Grace nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest. She didn't trust the silence. "Check the back," she ordered. "Make sure there's no one hiding." Elena and Sarah headed to the kitchen, while Marcus and Jake checked the bedrooms. Grace stayed in the living room, her eyes constantly darting to the windows. The infected were out there somewhere. They always were. A few minutes later, Elena returned, shaking her head. "Nothing in the kitchen. Just some cans of food, but it's old. Not much use." "Anything in the back?" Grace asked. "Nothing," Elena replied. "It's all clear." Grace exhaled slowly, her shoulders tense. "Okay, let's rest here for a while. We'll take turns keeping watch." They set up a makeshift camp in the living room, taking advantage of the relative safety of the farmhouse. Matthews sat in the corner, his eyes glassy, while the others settled in, trying to relax despite the constant threat looming outside. As the hours passed, Grace's thoughts turned again to the future. They had no idea where they were headed, or if they would ever find other survivors. But one thing was certain, they couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. The world they once knew was gone, but they were still alive. For now, that was all that mattered. And as dawn broke over the horizon, Grace knew that the hardest part of their journey was still to come. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting pale light over the farmhouse and the desolate landscape around it. The group had taken turns keeping watch through the night, but exhaustion weighed heavily on them all. They had managed to rest, though sleep had been fitful, filled with the sounds of distant growls and the occasional scrape of something dragging against the earth. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next wave of destruction. Grace stood by one of the windows, looking out at the empty fields that stretched beyond the farmhouse. The wind had picked up, rustling through the tall grass, but there was no sign of movement, no sign of the infected. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps they had found a safe haven, that maybe, just maybe, they could survive. The thought was fleeting, though. It was impossible to forget the endless nightmares that followed them, the crushing reality that nothing was ever truly safe. "How long are we staying here?" Matthew's voice broke through her thoughts. He was sitting on an old chair in the corner, his eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. The stress of the last few days had taken its toll on him. "Not long," Grace replied, her voice firm but weary. "We need to keep moving. We're not the only ones out here, and we need to find other survivors. We can't just hide forever." "We might not find anyone," Matthews muttered, the hopelessness in his tone impossible to ignore. "What if there's nothing left? What if we're the last ones?" Grace turned toward him, her gaze unwavering. "Then we fight. We keep going until we can't anymore. I won't give up. Not while there's a chance." The others were starting to stir, stretching out their stiff limbs and gathering their things. Elena came into the living room, her face pale but determined. I checked the road this morning, she said quietly. There's a sign up ahead. It looks like it's pointing toward a town. Maybe a refuge. How far? Grace asked, instantly alert. About 30 miles, Elena replied. We could walk it in a day if we move quickly. Or, if the Jeep's still working, we might be able to drive there. Let's see if the Jeep's still got some life in it, Grace said, already heading for the door. We can't afford to walk. Not with the infected out there. They moved quickly to the Jeep, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. The vehicle was still parked by the side of the farmhouse, its engine silent and still. Matthews slid into the driver's seat, turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life with a ragged growl, then steadied into a smooth hum. Thank God, Matthews muttered, relief flooding his voice. He adjusted the rearview mirror, his hands still trembling. I didn't think it was going to start. Let's go, Grace said, her voice laced with urgency. The faster we move, the better. The group piled into the Jeep, and Matthews carefully pulled out of the dirt driveway, the wheels crunching on gravel as they headed back toward the road. The landscape outside remained eerily still, the world seemingly frozen in time, as though waiting for something to happen. As they sped down the road, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The infected were out there, somewhere, but for now, the road ahead remained clear. They drove for miles, the scenery changing from dense forests to open fields. The further they went, the more desolate it became, as if the land itself had been abandoned. There was no sign of life, no wildlife, no movement. The world had become a ghost of what it once was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they saw it. A small town came into view, its buildings barely visible on the horizon, cloaked in the early morning mist. The sight was both relieving and terrifying. They had reached a place, but would it be any safer than the wilderness they had just left behind? Matthews slowed the Jeep as they approached the outskirts of the town. The streets were eerily quiet. No cars, no people. Just empty buildings with shattered windows and doors hanging off their hinges. The remnants of life seemed to have been erased here too. We need to check this place out, Grace said, her tone hardening as she assessed their surroundings. Stay alert. Keep your weapons ready. They drove through the town, scanning for any signs of life or danger. The buildings were in various states of disrepair, most of them long abandoned. Grace's eyes caught sight of a few old signs, remnants of the life that had existed here. A small grocery store, a diner, a post office, each one a ghost of what had once been a thriving community. They came to a stop in front of a large, fortified building, its windows were covered, and a large metal gate blocked the entrance. A sign on the gate read Safe Zone, do not enter without permission. Grace felt a flicker of hope. It looks like someone's been here, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Matthews pulled up to the gate and stopped, his eyes scanning the area. I don't see anyone. Elena pushed the door open cautiously and climbed out of the Jeep, her eyes darting around. Maybe they're watching us, she suggested, her voice tense. Or they're just waiting for the right moment. Grace nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Let's take a chance. We need to know if this place is safe. If there are survivors, we need to find them. They got out of the Jeep and cautiously approached the gate. Matthews tried the handle, but it was locked. After a few moments, he turned back to the group. We need to find a way inside, he said. We can't just sit here and wait. Grace looked around. There has to be another way in. Let's check the perimeter. They split up, walking around the building, looking for any signs of entry. At the back, they found a small, rusted door hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was barely visible, but it was open enough to slip through. Over here, Jake called, his voice low. The group gathered around the door, and Grace led the way, her senses on high alert. They moved inside quickly, the door creaking as it closed behind them. The interior of the building was dark and quiet. There was a musty smell in the air, but it didn't seem like the place had been abandoned for long. Hello? Grace called softly, her voice echoing in the emptiness. "Is anyone here?" For a moment, there was nothing. No response. Then, from the shadows, a voice called out. "Who are you?" The group froze. The voice was low, cautious, but there was something familiar about it. They all exchanged nervous glances before Grace stepped forward. "We're survivors," she said firmly. "We're looking for shelter. We don't want any trouble. We just need help." A figure stepped into view, an older man, grizzled and worn, holding a rifle. His clothes were tattered, but his eyes were sharp, scanning them with the cautious intensity of someone who had been living in a constant state of fear. "You found it," the man said, his voice gruff. "But don't get too comfortable. This place isn't a refuge. It's just another stop on a road that never ends." Grace felt her heart skip a beat. There were others here, other survivors. But she also knew that the man's words were true. The world was a broken place, and no matter where they went, the nightmare would always follow. For now, though, they had found a temporary safe haven. And that was enough. For now.